Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another Monday evening. Not much news from me today, only to say that the Ockham Singers, bless them, are carrying on with their rehearsals, which are going really well. And we even have a concert coming up at the end of this month. So on the 31st of October, we will be performing in a church. Variety of musics, a Bach cantata, Vivaldi Gloria, the piece by William Byrd, and Purcell's Hear My Prayer, amongst other things. The idea is that we're going to perform in a socially distanced way, minus masks, hopefully, given that we've got the space of a big church. And it's going to be streamed and recorded for audience to observe. But unfortunately, we won't have a live audience. But at least it's a performance and it's a way back in. So we're quite excited about that. Today, I thought I'd talk about the composer who actually wrote the piece I was playing just then. I won't tell you what that was just yet. But just to say that this particular composer, we should have been, I don't know whether we were or not, but we should have been celebrating 100-year anniversary of his death on Friday of last week. So the 2nd of October, 1920, was when Max Bruch died. Now, Max Bruch is familiar to everybody as the sort of the ultimate classical one-hit wonder composer. He's perhaps the best example there is of a one-hit wonder. If you perhaps don't include people like Pachelbel for his canon, but even Pachelbel's music is much better known. His other music, that is much better known than one could say some of the music of Bruch is. But why am I talking about Bruch specifically? Not just because of his anniversary, but because, believe it or not, during his lifetime, he was renowned primarily as a writer of choral works. That's how he made his bread and butter, and that's how he was known at the time as a choral composer. So this is really strange because we think, well, how come he wrote all this choral music, which was obviously very successful in his lifetime, and yet it's been forgotten? So I thought, well, I'll do a little bit of research and try and find out. So let me tell you, first of all, Max Bruch was born in 1838 and only died, as I said, in 1920. So he lived an incredibly long life, 82 years of his life. He was the son of a singing mother, a singer, professional singer mother, and a lawyer father. And rather unusually for composers, they actually encouraged him to be a composer, unlike most parents who historically seem to do everything possible to put their offspring off a career as a musician. And how come I'm doing the same thing? I don't know. Anyway, that's terrible. But unusually, he was encouraged by his parents. And he was a very successful teacher, composer. He taught at the Berlin Academy. He was a conductor himself. Would you believe he spent 3 years, I didn't know this, as principal conductor of the Liverpool Philharmonic from 1880 to 1803. He was the principal conductor of the Liverpool Philharmonic. So living and working in England and indeed touring with the orchestra. And while he was on tour, he met a singer, where have I heard that before, and married her. And she became his wife, obviously, and they even had a daughter born whilst they were in Liverpool. So he had a Scouse daughter, Margarita, would you believe? But what is it about Bruch and his one hit? Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with his first violin concerto. An absolutely amazing piece, one of the most beautiful romantic violin concertos, and indeed one of the most important violin concertos in the repertoire. It tends to be the one that every young violinist wants to play and learns at quite an early point in their career, not because it's particularly easy. The third movement is actually very technically challenging. But if you think of people like Nicola Benedetti and so on, all the really successful young violinists tend to be very enthusiastic exponents of the Bruch concerto. And it has become one of the best known and one of the most loved of all violin concertos, as I said. But one of the things that we need to remember about it is that it is much more closely associated with the music of, let's say, Mendelssohn and Brahms, rather than the music of Liszt or Wagner. So even in his own lifetime, towards the end of the 19th century, Bruch's music was considered quite conservative and quite not old-fashioned as such, but definitely in the safe bracket, as opposed to the much more forward-thinking music of Liszt and Wagner and Richard Strauss, when eventually, and then of course into the Second Viennese School of Schoenberg and all the rest of it. So of course Bruch was still alive when all of that was going on. We tend to think of him as being very much a figure of the mid-19th century, and forgetting, or not realizing in my case, that he actually lived well on into the 20th century. So that was part of the issue where Bruch was concerned. But there were other things involved. The concerto itself was written in 1866. So when he was quite young, he was only 28 when he wrote it. So it's very much a young person's work. When you think that he lived to be 82, it's very early. It was then revised a year later with the help of the distinguished violinist Joachim. So he put lots of ideas into it, and it's the revised edition dating from 1867 that is the one that we've become to know and love. But what else did Bruch write? Well, it's massive. There are probably something like 200 works in his catalogue. And these include at least three full-length operas, 20 or so oratorios, so major works for chorus, soloists, and orchestra. The oratorio scene was very important, as I said, to Bruch. And there must be about 20 on the list, I would say. Some of them are secular, and one or two are sacred, but most of them are secular. And I think well worth exploring. And I'll go into why they've probably got lost in a moment. But he also wrote not just one violin concerto, but three in all. He also wrote 3 symphonies, 3 orchestral suites. He wrote the Scottish Fantasy for violin and orchestra, and a very significant piece for cello and orchestra. And the subtitle of the piece that he wrote for cello was Adagio on Hebrew themes. Now, this was to cause Bruch a huge amount of trouble later on in his career, because he'd chosen to write on Hebrew themes, and there were one or two other examples of using Hebrew texts. Contemporary Germans tended to assume that Bruch was Jewish. And so towards the end of his life, and certainly immediately after he passed away, his music wasn't touched with a barge pole in Germany, for that simple reason that they suspected him of being Jewish. In actual fact, it's absolutely certain that he wasn't Jewish. And there are often references made to his name being not just Max Bruch, but Max Christian Friedrich Bruch. So whether that was just an extra name that was inserted to try and make it clear that he wasn't Jewish, or whether it was, as it were, a name he was given on his birth certificate, I don't think anybody's very clear about. But nevertheless, it shows how determined he was to try and demonstrate that he wasn't Jewish. So that's one reason why his music rather fell into disrepute. And the second reason, as I said, is because he was associated with being rather old school, more Brahms than Liszt, if you see what I mean. There are other reasons why I think we should feel a little sympathy for Bruch. As well as his falling out with his contemporaries, he did get very grumpy towards the end of his life because of the fact that even in his lifetime, people only associated him with that one piece, the first Violin Concerto. And it got to the point where he would actually be quite rude to people when they would come up to him and say, "Oh, can I play your wonderful concerto for you?" And he'd reply by saying, "Which wonderful concerto? I've written 3 and they're all wonderful." And they would only ever want to play the first Violin Concerto. So that must have been somewhat annoying. And I can see that he would be a little bit aggrieved by that. Another thing that happened to him towards the end of his life was that he got quite poor. That can happen to any of us, after all, and was slightly short of cash. And he happened to have written a piece for 2 American pianists. It's quite a long story, but I'll sort of condense it. Basically, these two female American pianists were called Rose and Ottilie Sutro. Rose and Ottilie Sutro, the Sutro sisters, living and working in America. They asked him to produce a piece for them, which he did. But what he did was to transcribe the 3rd of his orchestral suites and turned it into a concerto for 2 pianos and orchestra. So he sent it to them in America saying, "Here it is, here's your piece, I hope you enjoy it, blah, blah, blah." They obviously looked at it, didn't particularly take to it. They adapted it and made it their own, changed a huge amount, and performed, we think, their own version of this piece, this concerto for 2 pianos, but never the piece as Bruch actually wrote it. But Bruch, of course, was not aware of this. And instead, as I said, as he was getting slightly hard for cash towards the end of his life, he thought, I know, I'll send my original score of the famous Violin Concerto and ask them to sell it for me in America, where I'm sure it'll get a reasonable price and they can then send me the proceeds. So he did this. He sent them his score. They, would you believe, did nothing with it except hang on to it. They didn't sell it until after he died, and then they did sell it and pocketed all the money, which was pretty foul, not a good thing to do. And you can understand why he would be not very happy with that. So one other thing that's just worth mentioning, that he was always so in awe of many of his contemporaries. So whilst he was writing in the most wonderfully crafted, rich romantic style, he was very aware that other composers of his generation and a bit later were moving on to a field of music, a style of music for which he was never really suited. And I think he felt that he wasn't entirely at home in the new style of music, the new styles of music that were coming to fruition at the end of the 19th century. And when we think of it from our point of view, looking back, it must have been an extraordinary time to be alive as a composer, when you think that you were born just 11 years after the death of Beethoven, but you were still alive through Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Wagner, Strauss, Stravinsky, you name it. He would have been aware of all of these composers, and his life stretched way back, as I say, almost to Beethoven and all the way forward to Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, Stravinsky, Mahler, Bruckner. I mean, he saw it all, or would have heard it all anyway. must have been quite extraordinary. And as a professional conductor as well as a composer, of course, he would be working with all these pieces and performing them with the various orchestras and various posts that he had as a conductor. So incredibly aware, and that must have been quite hard to live with, I think, as a composer in his own particular style. So what is it, just to return to the violin concerto itself, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but what is it about this piece that has made it so endearing and so much loved by audiences and performers? Well, to begin with, it has a number of quite new ideas for its time, 1860s, remember. He dispenses with the long orchestral introduction. Instead, it just starts with a very simple sort of chorale theme in the orchestra, and the violin comes in straight away with a sort of type of cadenza. So to actually start a concerto with what is effectively a very small cadenza, that was pretty novel. Secondly, he used the idea, in a way borrowed from Mendelssohn, but nevertheless, the idea of linking movements together. So, for instance, the end of the first movement leads directly into the adagio, the middle movement. That was comparatively novel. And thirdly, it was the use of the violin not just as a single instrument playing this beautifully spun melodies, but also the interaction between the violin and the orchestra, so that there was a real sense of at times the soloist being what you'd expect a violin soloist to be, very much away from the orchestra. Look at me, I'm the important one. The orchestra are my accompaniment. And at other times it becomes much more integrated, much more like chamber music, where the violin is playing with sections of the orchestra, woodwind, the strings, and so on. So it was quite a new way of thinking about the relationship between the soloist and the tutti. And when you think of the just sheer magical beauty of some of the melodic material, I mean, if I just remind you of the slow movement, this amazing theme. Theme you'll all be very familiar with, I'm sure. It's constantly topping the classic FM charts. It's performed at the proms virtually every year. It's just played all the time, and one can see why. But what I would like to do is to encourage you all to investigate some of the other pieces that he wrote. Have a listen to the Scottish Fantasy for violin and orchestra. Have a listen to that infamous cello piece, the Adagio on Hebrew themes, which caused him so much grief, so much trouble. And also, it's well worth investigating the symphonies as well. All three of them are great pieces. I will try and investigate some of the choral repertoire, which is really hard to get hold of. by the way, but I will investigate it and see if there's anything that would be good to resurrect when we were able to resurrect choral music and put on a performance. So that would be really interesting. And also the three suites, the three orchestral suites. There's a concerto for clarinet and viola. Not many of those around, so that's worth investigating. And a whole host of chamber music, including a lot for viola and a lot for clarinet. And that's quite significant because, of course, there isn't much repertoire for viola, and there's even less in some ways for the clarinet, because the clarinet was invented comparatively late, and just many composers wrote for violin and piano and string quartets and all of that sort of thing. And occasionally you get a flute piece or an oboe piece, but it's comparatively rare for clarinets and bassoons for that matter as well. So definitely worth investigating. And if we can all just appreciate Bruch in the 100th anniversary of his passing, I think we will be doing him a real service. Poor chap, in spite of all his troubles and difficulties and grumpiness at the fact that nobody wanted to play any of his music other than the one piece, the first concerto. While I'm on the subject of neglected pieces, can I just bring your attention to one other piece, which I heard, funny enough, this afternoon. It was on Radio 3, and it was a concert, I think, of the BBC Philharmonic, conducted by John Wilson, who, as you know, is the most amazing conductor, so dynamic, and he just inspires orchestras to play at the very top of their form. I don't know how he does it. I'm deeply envious, but he is amazing, absolutely amazing. And the piece I heard this afternoon, which I would heartily recommend, was by Eric Coates, of all people. Now, Eric Coates we are familiar with as being the composer of the Dam Busters and all sorts of light music. And this is kind of in the same vein, in that it is very much on the light element, light end of the spectrum. But it was a piece called Enchanted Garden. I've never heard it before. It's quite long, it's quite intricate, and it has a huge amount of contrasting material and wonderful different textures and rhythms. And 1 minute you think it's going to go off into some kind of elaborate foxtrot. Other moments it's deeply sonorous and full of rich romanticism, and at other points it's jaunty and typical, almost film music like. But as you would expect for Eric Coates, the craftsmanship, the sheer amazing imagination of the man, and the way in which he orchestrates it and makes this comparatively simple music. It doesn't have the weight of a big symphony. It doesn't have the complexity of some of his more worthy academic kind of colleagues, but it's amazingly exciting to listen to. And I was absolutely transfixed. I had to stop the car. I was in the car at the time, and I just had to stop and listen to it till it had finished. I knew what it was because it came up on the screen in the car. So that wasn't, fortunately, if I'd been trying to guess what it was, I'd have got nowhere near it. But I can heartily recommend. You'll get it on BBC Sounds. It was on at about 4 o'clock, I think, this afternoon on the Radio 3 schedule. Do have a listen. You won't be disappointed. It was just an amazing piece and scintillatingly played by the BBC Philharmonic and John Wilson. So today it's all been about forgotten composers or neglected works of composers. I think it's really good for people like me to encourage people like you to investigate some of these pieces and some of these composers, especially somebody like Bruch, who, poor chap, really suffered from being a one-hit wonder. And with that thought, I will leave you for tonight. Thank you very much for listening, my loyal listener. and all your colleagues. And I shall look forward to talking to you again next week on yet another topic. All the best. Keep well. Nice to see you. Good night.